Good evening. I'm James Roth, Deputy Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Tonight, we are honored to have with us a native son. E.J. Dionne Jr. grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, where he attended Catholic school, then graduated from Harvard University and received a doctorate of philosophy and sociology from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Working first for the New York Times, he covered state, local, and national politics and served as a foreign correspondent before joining the Washington Post in 1990 as a political reporter and has been writing a column for the Post since 1993. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University, where he teaches in the McCourt School of Public Policy and the Government Department. Dionne analyzes politics weekly on NPR's All Things Considered and is a regular analyst for MSNBC. In 2014-15, he was vice president of the American Political Science Association and is chair of the editorial committee of Democracy Journal. He is the author of 6 books and edited or co-edited 6 other volumes, including Why Americans Hate Politics, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was a National Book Award nominee. His newest bestseller, Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism, From Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond, has received praise and favorable reviews from the Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, New York Times Book Review, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Washington Post, among many others. One reviewer wrote, quote, "The book makes the cause that contemporary conservatism must reverse course on a calamitous step that conservatism took 50 years ago. There are 16 persuasive chapters brimming with good analysis that argue to this point. This is a book with great insight, attention to detail, and beautifully researched." Another wrote, "The book will be required reading for political insiders, for academics, for think tank thinkers, for editorial writers." And I should also mention that Mr. Dionne's book is on sale in our museum store. He has graciously agreed to sign books following the forum, and that signing will be taking place in the Smith Center lobby. Our moderator this evening is David Gergen, a senior political analyst for CNN, who had previously served as an advisor to 4 presidents of both parties, which he has written about in his book, Eyewitness to Power, The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. He is professor of public service and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We welcome you both. So, I would be remiss if I didn't reference President Kennedy, so let me end with a quote from his book, Profiles in Courage. Quote, "The true democracy, living and growing and inspiring, puts its faith in the people. Faith that the people will not simply elect men who will represent their views ably and faithfully, but will also elect men who will exercise their conscientious judgment. Faith that the people will not condemn those whose devotion to principle leads them to unpopular courses, but will reward courage, respect honor, and ultimately recognize right." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming tonight. EJ, you're a wonderful draw. This is terrific to look out at this audience, and we welcome you back to Massachusetts. I think it'd be really interesting to ask, how many of you here, your mic is not working? It is or isn't? It's not? Do I need to turn it on? Is help on the way?
It's good to have extras.
that better?
Maybe put it higher.
Is that better? I can swallow. EJ. Now, I want to quick, it'd be interesting to ask. How many of you have voted for a Republican candidate for president sometime in your lifetime? How many of you have voted for a Republican candidate for president recently? Aha. How many of you intend to vote for a Republican candidate for president this time around? One hand. Lonely hand back there. There's two. There's three.
You have to get in the front of the line when it's a Q&A.
I think that we've seen your book fits the mood of the audience, right? It isn't. So I will. You've been out on a very successful book tour. And as you well know, there are two types of people who do the moderator interviews on book tours. One type is a person who you think maybe read your book, and then the other type is someone who never read any book. I'm in the category of person who read part of your book. Because this is it's a long story, but anyway, I'm glad to be here. And we couldn't have someone more appropriate at this time of this year when we're all trying to figure out what in the devil is going on with American politics, how do we understand it, than someone who has thought about this greatly, cares about the quality of democracy, and remarkably, in the reviews that were so positive, one of those reviews came from the National Review. One of those reviews said, people on the right will be suspicious when a man from the left writes about us. But this is a fair book. Not always right, but a fair book, and it's one conservatives ought to be reading as well as everyone else. That's a remarkable tribute to you.
It is my favorite review in some ways. That was not one I anticipated.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Well, in some ways, it's appropriate that we're here at the Kennedy Library to begin a conversation because so much of your book centers on what happened in the 60s and how the Republican Party swerved as it did, and how it left behind the Eisenhower years, and much of what that tradition was all about. And the party of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt has now become the Tea Party of Trump. It's a remarkable change. So help us work us through that journey. Give us the arc of the book so everyone can understand that up front.
Yeah, thank you, David. I just want to thank the Kennedy Library. First of all, it's such an honor to be here. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. And I have a lot of old friends in the audience here. I just have to mention three people. One is my sister Lucianne and her husband Drew Thomas. Thank you so much for being here. And also because we are a virtual family, my friend Cheryl Kaiser, where are you, Cheryl? Hello. Cheryl's dad, our dad died in 1968, a very important year. I always say that three great Americans left us in 1968, and one of them was our dad. And so Cheryl's dad became like a second father to me, and Cheryl and her brothers welcomed me into their family. So it's great to see you all here today. It's also great to be back in New England. I just want to point out for the record that the dissenting judge in the Brady case is a dear and old friend of mine. And that I have utterly enjoyed Deflategate because it's the only time in my life where I have learned what it's like to be a commentator on Fox News. Because I don't really care what the facts are. I just know which side I'm on. The book, I also just really want to thank David Gergen for doing this. I looked it up. David edited a piece I wrote 38 years ago, which is a point I make just to make us both feel really old. But it was a real joy to write for him those 38 years ago. And one of the things I hope we could do here is to have a bit of a conversation about Richard Nixon, because I found those years I found Nixon a particularly fascinating character because he embodied in himself all of the divisions in the Republican Party, that it was both in his staff and in himself and in the way he thought about the world. But this book, the core argument of the book, first sentence of the book, is that the history of contemporary American conservatism is a story of disappointment and betrayal. And I argue that ever since Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination in 1964, which I think we will look back on 50 or 100 years from now as one of the most important events of the 20th century, because it fundamentally altered the Republican Party. Ever since Goldwater's nomination, Republican politicians have had to make a series of promises that they couldn't possibly keep. They promised to reduce the size of government. Neither Nixon nor Reagan nor either President Bush was able to do that. Government was exactly the same size as a percentage of the economy when Reagan left office as it was when he took office. He shuffled the spending around some.
It didn't grow at the same rate, but it didn't.
Well, but it grew with the economy.
Right.
So it was,
It didn't have the kind of spectacular growth we saw in Johnson, for example.
well, Johnson did establish new programs, but but it had already grown in that period. Reagan couldn't shrink it, is the point.
Right, exactly.
And neither could any of the other Republican presidents. And the reason for that is because two great analysts of public opinion back in the 60s, Hadley Free and Lloyd Cantrell, famously said that Americans are ideological conservatives but operational liberals, which is to say we mistrust government, we say a lot of negative things about government, but we actually want government to do a lot of stuff. And my favorite example of this were members of the Tea Party who just happened on the whole to be at, near, or over the age of 65, wanted to cut government, but absolutely did not want to cut Social Security or Medicare. And you can go through a whole list of programs. So conservatives couldn't keep that promise. They promised to roll back the cultural changes of the 60s, which was not possible, and most Americans didn't want to do, in fact. And of late, they promised to change the ethnic makeup of the country back to what it was somewhere back in 1940. That's not a keepable promise unless you're willing to deport 11 million people, for starters. So that with Goldwater, these promises were set in place. It created a cycle of radicalization, a cycle of disappointment, betrayal, and radicalization. It also created a process of purging and withdrawal. We in Massachusetts, people remember, there used to be such a thing as liberal Republicans. And we remember people like Javits and Clifford Case in New Jersey, whom National Review magazine used to refer to as hopeless case. Or Ed Brooke here in Massachusetts. These folks either lost elections, but many of them were purged in Republican primaries, and then the moderates were purged. But with that also came a withdrawal of moderates from the Republican Party. Think of Middlesex County here in Massachusetts, what Barney Frank, for those of you who remember the old Boston phone books, the people of the Green Book. Those folks used to be Republicans. They were kind of Saltonstall, Brooke, Frank Sargent kind of Republicans. They left, and that happened all over the country. Tonight, watch in the Pennsylvania primary, the collar counties around Philadelphia used to be loyal. George H.W. Bush, John Hines, Republicans. A lot of them are Democrats now, just like David's question at the beginning. So this has created a very different party. The other thing I stressed in the book, which I think really does help explain Donald Trump, and there is a lot of Trump in the book. I actually asked my editor to put Trump in the subtitle, and somehow, out of personal feelings, she didn't want to, I think, in her view, despoil the subtitle, but it might have been good for sales of the book. I tried that too. The Republicans have relied on the votes of a lot of white working class voters for a long time, and they haven't delivered anything to them. And this isn't just some liberal like me saying this. This is Republicans like former Governor Tim Pawlenty, who used to say, we have to be the party of Sam's Club. Writers like Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam, who said, if we don't deliver to these folks at some point, we're going to be in a heap of trouble. Donald Trump is their heap of trouble. Donald Trump, a billionaire, or at least somebody who tells us he's a billionaire, is leading a class war inside the Republican Party, and that is part of the Trump rebellion.
Let's go back before it's such a catnip to get into today's race. But let's understand a little bit how we got here again. The conservative versus more moderate wing of the party. There had been a fight for a long time, going all the way back to the 1912 election in particular. You know, when Teddy Roosevelt broke away from Taft.
Right.
When he ran, he wanted the presidency back. You know, Taft wanted the convention. Roosevelt forms a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and he calls it, you know, this is Armageddon. This is the battle of the Lord. And there were these two forces that went up against each other. And that split continued right through Eisenhower versus Taft in 1952. But the conservatives of those days, had they changed? Was it because they usually lost those battles and therefore they weren't running the Republican Party? Or did the conservatism itself change? How do you get from Eisenhower 52 through 60, a highly successful presidency, 64% approval on average for 8 years, unbelievable, to a rejection of Eisenhower, what he stood for, by the conservatives, and then they take over by Goldwater?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you raised. I remember how Richard Nixon used to say whenever somebody asked him a question he didn't like, he would always say, "I'm glad you asked that question."
Yeah, right.
Well, in this case, I actually am glad you asked that question.
With the accent.
Well, with apologies to the Stevenson fans in the audience, Ike is actually a hero in this book, because you're quite right about that long fight in the party. Just to prove I am an utter political nerd, I'm reading a brilliant biography of Tom Dewey right now. It's a wonderful book, by the way.
That must be pretty far down your list of desirable books.
Yeah, no, the writer, actually, Richard Norton Smith, is a brilliant biographer. You know, this fight goes back, as you say, to TR, but also all during the 30s. You know, Willkie winning the nomination, then Dewey, and then Eisenhower. This idea of disappointment is deep in the conservative movement. Phyllis Schlafly's book, A Choice on an Echo, written to support Goldwater, sounded, again, very contemporary. It was about the secret kingmakers who delivered the party to these liberal Wall Street interests. And what's curious about the Goldwater Ike thing is that I see the conservatives, the National Review conservatives, the Goldwater conservatives, as even more opposed to Eisenhower republicanism than they were to the liberals. Because in their view, well, at least the liberals were over there, they were in the right party. They saw Eisenhower as a liberal. And I argue in my book that Eisenhower was actually a conservative, but of a different kind, that this was not a liberal conservative fight, but an internecine conservative fight, that he was much more a Burkean conservative. Burke wrote about the qualities a statesman needed, where it was a disposition to preserve and a desire to improve. He knew that preserving something actually required reform and improvement. I discovered that the only actual living conservative I could find who agrees with me on Ike as a conservative is Joe Scarborough, which, yeah, you can take that however you want. It did help me get on Morning Joe for this book, which was a good thing. But Joe Scarborough actually made the case because he was successful. And what's fascinating, he said conservatives have to stop thinking of Eisenhower as a liberal in golf shoes. And what's fascinating is Eisenhower began converting the South to the Republican Party without a Southern strategy. And that, in fact, Eisenhower not only started winning Southern states, but he also took about 40% of the non-white vote in the country. And I think what was different about the later conservatism was the Southernization of Republican conservatism. I think the Goldwater campaign really marked a shift in power in the Republican Party from the north.
The geographic center of gravity.
Gravity from north to south.
Northeast to southwest.
Right, and now even, but in particular to the south, and that the racial attitudes that had characterized the old segregationist Democrats in the South shifted right into the Republican Party after 1964. with a result, that is one of the reasons why all of these northern Republicans started wondering what has happened to my party. And even northern Republican politicians had to be what used to be said about Democrats back in the 1850s. They were northern men of southern convictions.
Right. But I'm anxious not to have Goldwater conflated with the Civil Rights Act, because they were two different. The Goldwater thrust came before the Civil Rights Acts and drove the South as it did. In other words, in 64, 65, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights bills, he told Bill Moyers, the South is never going to be Democratic again. It's going to go into the Republican Party.
Right, but see, one of the things that I think conservatives need to come to terms with, and we've talked a lot because of President Obama about how much did opposition to Obama have to do with race, and we can talk about that. But what I argue is that if you go back and look at the history of conservatism, they, starting in the 1950s, were very clear that the future of conservatism lay in an alliance with the South. For example, National Review magazine, and I'm a big fan of Bill Buckley, even though I didn't agree with him, but National Review in the 50s and early 60s was on the wrong side of civil rights. National Review magazine, August 24th, 1957, Why the South Must Prevail is their editorial. And it said that, the editorial asked, quotes, whether the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally in areas where it does not predominate numerically. And the editorial went on, the sobering answer is yes, the white community is so entitled because for the time being, it is the advanced race. This is National Review, the intellectual journal of the right, saying this in 1957, so that Goldwater himself was not a racist. And when he was on the Phoenix City Council, he had supported local civil rights laws, but both in the conscience of a conservative, where he was critical of Brown v. Board, and then when he voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he used the Southern states' rights arguments against the 64 Act. He used the property rights argument, so that I think it's important. The right, I think the American conservatism really needs to come to terms with the ways in which it was intertwined with this racial reaction, even before the 60s came along, even before LBJ signed that bill.
I agree with that, but the segregationists were led by Democrats in the South, not by Republicans, and through the 50s. And even up through Nixon 1960, he did pretty well.
Well, Nixon was a very racially liberal guy. We forget that he was very advanced on civil rights.
Right.
And indeed, when Richard Nixon ran for Congress in the first year we were in the Kennedy Library, Nixon's literature actually called him something like a fighting liberal or a practical liberal, and Kennedy's literature in 1946 called himself a conservative. So Kennedy and Nixon in their campaign literature in 1946 used the opposite labels.
What I'm arguing there is that the thrust toward conservatism and the rise of Goldwater was less driven by race than by a rejection of the moderates who were leading the party, like Eisenhower. And then along came the Civil Rights Bills of 64 and 65, which drove away a lot of Southern whites who were Democrats and opened the door to George Wallace. And he became the third party candidate in 68. And then Nixon, I think that one of the worst mistakes the Republicans have ever made was to incorporate and try to go after those Southern whites and accept the racism in the bargain. That they invited in people who were racist at core, and it changed the party.
Right. Well, I think that's true. I think there are two ways to look at the history, which are both accurate, and it depends on where. The standard account is just as you say, that it really begins with the Civil Rights Act. Wallace becomes the way station for Southern conservatives to enter the Republican Party. They leave the Democratic Party, and so the party that had given us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was suddenly allied with the South. But there's a longer history where it started to break down all the way back into the late 30s. It's one of the things writing this book was very instructive to me, that the formation of the alliance in Congress between Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats began in the late Roosevelt years, what was called the Conservative Coalition, so that even though Democrats had a nominal majority in Congress, a lot of times it was ruled by this coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans. So the interpenetration of conservative Republicanism and Southern conservatism was there even before the formal conversion. And it's fascinating to think about because one of the things that changed American politics was the migration of African Americans from the South in the 30s and 40s. When they moved to northern cities, they became Democrats. Right. And so suddenly the party that had been the bulwark of segregation, all of these northern Democratic leaders depended on African American votes in the North. And that's when the South began to realize that if the white South, that they were probably in the wrong party. I discovered through Ira Katznelson, the great historian, a book called Wither's Solid South, written back in 1947, where this writer foresaw that the South was going to have to go in a different direction and that Republicans were going to be their natural allies because they opposed the power of the federal government.
Well, that's right. Well, you know, it was FDR himself who very, very much thought that American politics would be better if there was a liberal party and a conservative party.
Right, and we've had mixed results since.
And he tried to purge the Democratic Party of a lot of the white Southerners, you know, back in
38, and he failed.
And he failed. Yeah. But his whole notion was, and the American Political Science Association came around and embraced the view that American politics would be healthier with a conservative party versus a liberal party. And I'm just wondering, do you think that turned out to be wrong?
There was a piece that David refers to called Toward a Responsible Party System, put out by by the American Political Science Association in 1950 or 51, I think. And Tom Mann, my colleague at the Brookings Institution, and I have wanted, someday we're going to write this essay, we wanted to go back to that essay, and it basically wanted to sort us, liberal and conservative. And now we look around at our politics, and we are nicely sorted, liberal and conservative, and we're not completely happy with it right now. It's led to, it's made inter-party deal-making more difficult. It's more sort of small d democratic in the sense that when you vote for a party, you pretty much know the package you're voting for. I sure miss a bunch of the liberal Republicans that I write about in my book, and you do wonder if we were a little less sorted, if there was still a little bit of the elements in each party, would it be easier for us to do business together? And I think maybe it would. Well, in other words, I share the premise of your question in having second thoughts on that, although I do not miss the Southern segregationists.
Okay. The Republicans miss the moderate.
Yeah, and I think they miss the moderating element in their party. I think that's one of the striking things. This is an argument you and I could have, or people in the audience and I could have. I really do agree with Tom and Norm, or Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, and write about this in the book, that the polarization in the two parties is asymmetric, that the Republicans have moved farther right than the Democrats have moved left. And just two quick pieces of data on that. If you ask people, are you liberal, moderate, or conservative, 2/3 of Republicans think of themselves as conservative. About half of them think of themselves as very conservative. In the Democratic Party, it's still only about 41% who think of themselves as liberal. So even to this day, more Democrats think of themselves as moderate or even conservative than think of themselves as liberal. Or if you ask Democrats and Republicans, do you prefer a politician who compromises to get things done or one who sticks to his principles? Right. About 6 in 10 Democrats prefer the compromiser. Only about 35% of Republicans prefer the compromiser. So something is going on here, but it is asymmetric, and that is why, again, if I may cheat and go to today's primaries, it's why Hillary Clinton is running ahead in the Democratic primary, and the two Republican frontrunners are Donald Trump and Ted Cruz.
I'm still trying to keep that catnip at bay here for just a moment.
It's the journalist in me.
I want to go back. I want to go back to this question. When you divide out the parties in the liberal versus conservative, what makes it very difficult is to go back to the Moynihan formulation. You and I both have a mentor, same mentor, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and both miss him. But I remember being in the Clinton White House, and when we were trying to pass Hillary Care, and he was chair of the Finance Committee, and he would call me and send me notes and send me historical references, saying you have to understand that the secret success of our democracy has been when we've had big milestone legislation, social legislation, going back to the 30s, it's always been passed with supermajorities. That a significant number of people from the other side, usually Republicans, would come vote for it, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, Civil Rights I, Civil Rights II. You can go through the list. They all got like 65 to 70 votes in the Senate. And the fact that they got votes from the other side built a consensus in the country. Because when the other party had endorsed it, it was no longer a party issue. It was this is what we've done together as two parties. And it solidified support. Whereas in recent years, Obamacare got 0 votes on the Republican side. The Iran agreement, basically 0 votes. The major big milestones of the Obama administration get no votes, and they become political footballs. And Moynihan's argument was, you need people from the other side when you pass this stuff in order to give it permanence, in order to have it settle in.
I thought a lot about that as you did when Moynihan said that. By the way, I've been watching this political campaign, and I've been thinking about Moynihan a lot, and his famous essay, Defining Deviancy Down, seems quite relevant to the 2016 campaign. The problem with the Moynihan view is twofold. One, on a lot of those pieces of legislation, the final vote was not reflective of the actual fighting. In other words, a lot of those pieces of legislation, a lot of Republicans threw in with Democratic legislation in the end on final passage, but they resisted it a lot more as it went along. But you were also talking about a time when there were plenty of Republicans who were actually more liberal than many members of the Democratic Party.
Exactly.
So that it was easy for a Jacob Javits to vote for Medicare, but that what you had then is a situation where Republicans were simply refusing to go along. There were no Republican votes for social reform anymore, and I think Obamacare is really the classic case in point. For conservatives in the audience might be upset by this, but Obamacare was the most conservative possible way to do national expand health coverage. It was, after all, based on the Massachusetts plan that Mitt Romney pushed. It was Heritage's idea on the exchanges, the idea of a mandate, which, in fairness to history, Obama hit Hillary Clinton for favoring in the 2008 election. But the mandate came from Republicans like John Chafee. The individual mandate was John Chafee and Bob Dole, because they didn't like the employer mandate in Obamacare. So Obama takes all of these fundamentally conservative ideas, and there wasn't a single Republican vote for it. And the question is, will Obamacare endure anyway? And I have a hunch that it will, actually, because when you watch the Republicans say repeal and replace, they have yet, all these years later, to propose a comprehensive replacement of Obamacare, because as they back up and say, well, we want something market-oriented. Well, this kept the private insurance market alive. Well, we don't want to sort of take away that sections say that you can keep your kid on your parents' health insurance till 26. So they back up, and every time they try to pass something different, it's, funnily enough, I think in those meetings, looks like Obamacare. So I think it'll be an interesting test case of the Moynihan thesis. Will Obamacare endure? Now, if there's unified...
It's going to depend heavily on whether Hillary wins. If she wins, it's done.
It's done. Yeah. But I think the interesting question will be, if they repeal it, what does it do? They're going to be throwing millions and millions of people off health insurance. They're not going to do that. And they can't do that. And so I think they're going to end up, they'll repeal it and replace it with Obamacare.
I think you'll be unhappy with the result if they get a hold of it. I don't think it'll be quite as felicitous as you think.
I don't think anything will be felicitous in that situation. I agree with that.
Yeah, okay, so let's come back. Let's retrace this a little bit, because after Goldwater lost, and lost massively in '64, then the Nixon comeback really did represent, for a lot of conservatives, a rejection of what Goldwater stood for. It was a capitulation back to the moderates. But Nixon himself, as you say, was this interesting fusion of different, I mean, Eisenhower had selected Nixon to please the conservatives back in '52 when he brought him on the ticket. He was looking for a young person who would actually appease the conservatives. And that's what, but when Nixon ran in '68, he ran partly with Goldwater, but partly outside. He didn't want to be Goldwater all over again. But he brought to the office then this mixture of both a philosophy and a personal views. It was really striking to me when I went out for the next opening of the Nixon Library. And he said, "Come, I want to show you some things inside." And I thought we'd go to the foreign policy wing of the Nixon Library, and he went straight to the domestic. He said, "My proudest accomplishments are here." And I was like, "What?"
Well, some people have said Nixon was the last liberal president.
Yeah, Mark Shields. That's
And I've sort of speculated if Nixon, even to recite this sentence in this room, I know will bring the wrath of God on me, but what if Nixon had beaten Kennedy in 1960? The Nixon who would have been elected in 1960 would have been a very moderate president. He was essentially the continuity of the Eisenhower years. And in many ways, that Nixon was what some people around Eisenhower call modern republicanism, which was trying to adjust to the realities of American life. And Nixon might have passed a civil rights bill. Imagine if it's Richard Nixon as the hero of civil rights. But Nixon knew Nixon was nothing if not a shrewd politician, and realized after '64 that the balance of power in the Republican Party had shifted decisively toward the right. And he knew that the right would never fully trust him, but that he could never be elected unless he had significant support on the right. So unlike many of the moderate Republicans, he campaigned actively for Barry Goldwater in 1964, which won him enormous credibility on the right end of the Republican Party. He understood the shift in the balance of power toward the South, and so he courted Southern leaders. And one of the most important voices for him at the '68 convention was Strom Thurmond, the former segregationist Democrat turned Republican senator from South Carolina. And so throughout, Nixon walked this path where he had this old modern Republican past, which was still part of him. He governed with Democrats controlling Congress and was willing to sign a lot of the stuff they put on his desk. So he created the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He indexed Social Security. I sound like a Nixon ad. He had the opening to China. He sponsored détente. I mean, this eventually became too much for a lot of conservatives. Yet, he also inaugurated the Southern strategy. He was tough on crime. He played the race card when he had to, used acid amnesty and abortion against McGovern in 1972. And one of the people I talked to for the book, who was fascinating, as you know, was Pat Buchanan. Incidentally, one of the fun things about doing this book was to sit down with a whole lot of different kinds of conservatives who knew they were unlikely to convert me, but were really open in trying to explain what had happened to the movement. And Pat, both in the interview and in his own book about Nixon, talks about how if you looked at his staff in the '68 campaign, you had the writing staff, people like him and Jeff Bell, who were constantly sending memos to Nixon saying, take it to the liberals. Whenever you do, you gain ground. And Nixon would scribble, yeah, you're right. And then there were the moderates and the liberals on his staff, people like Len Garman and Ray Price, who'd say, no, you can't do that. And they'd pull Nixon back. And it seemed that Nixon would scribble his id on the memos, but his superego would take over from these other guys, his sort of moderate superego, if you'll forgive the psychobabble here. And that was Nixon all the way through. It was these two. So the whole conflict in the Republican Party was fought out inside Richard Nixon. Did you sense that when you were?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I happened to be on the speechwriting team And, we had Bill Sapphire, and who would often, quite moderate, and he would write these lyrical things, and then Nixon would send it over to Buchanan to sprinkle in Buchananisms, through it and harden it up here and there. There was indeed a tension in that staff about right and left. There were tensions about also playing by the rules and not playing by the rules. I mean, there are a whole series of different tensions, and how do you go after your opponents? I mean, there was the Colson, wing, which it had nothing to do with conservatism or not. It had everything to do with how do you bludgeon your opponents, and versus the Ray Price, Glenn Garment side, which said you got to play fair, and you got to play. It's not the law of the jungle. So he was a deeply conflicted. Nixon was a deeply conflicted man, and I think it didn't resolve the conservatism problem. Where conservatism was. By the time he left office, everything had been thrown up in the air by Watergate and by the war.
And the irony is, one of the arguments of the book is that every time Republicans lost, the party would ratchet to the right. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the great ironies of Watergate is that rather in the short run, it strengthened Democrats and liberals. Right. Democrats had the big victory in 1974. Right. Jimmy Carter wins, though narrowly, right. Over Gerald Ford. But it was a great triumph for conservatives because Nixon, in a way, was the last person standing between the conservatives and complete control of the Republican Party. Right. And Watergate helped discredit government. So Watergate, while it was a Republican sin, if you will, actually strengthened the conservative Republican argument because between Vietnam and Watergate, people lost a lot of faith in government in the 1970s, and then right. the great inflation under Carter did some of the rest of the work, and the country was ready to vote for Reagan.
That's right. It laid the predicate for Reagan.
Right, and I think that continued because when George H.W. Bush lost, the party ratcheted right again under Newt Gingrich. And then when W lost, a lot of conservatives, instead of saying, well, maybe this had something to do with the Iraq War or the big economic downturn, a lot of them instead explained it as, well, he was a big government Republican. And so conservatives have found a way to almost always to explain defeat as being the result of insufficient loyalty and fidelity to Republican principles, to conservative principles.
Well, that's Ted Cruz's whole argument.
Correct.
Yeah. They betrayed us. And 2/3 of Republican voters think they betrayed us. But help us understand then what happened to conservatism from Reagan on. Because Reagan, as Dick Darman wrote in his book about Reagan, he was much more conservative in his rhetoric than he was in his practice. He was more pragmatic in his governing than he was in his rhetoric.
Completely right. The first chapter of the book, I decided I had to sort of deal with Reagan in advance and then back into him again. And the first chapter of the book is called The Ambiguous Hero, and it's about Reagan. Mm-hmm. And another of the conservatives I spoke with is Charles Krauthammer, the conservative columnist, and he had a great line where he simply said, "You can choose your Reagan," he said of conservatives. And in fact, people have done that all the time. So on the one hand, Reagan really was a movement-building conservative who took all of the right-wing ideological positions. He opposed Medicare, wanted to privatize Social Security. Pardon me. He came to prominence giving a great speech for Goldwater a week before the election. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how my sister and I grew up in a conservative family, and I started becoming a liberal when I was 13, and my dad was a very open-minded conservative, and he encouraged me to argue with him. So we had a great time arguing. But I will never forget as a 12-year-old watching that Reagan speech in our living room saying, this is a guy who's going to save us. And millions of conservatives were just like us, sitting in our living rooms seeing Reagan. So one thing Reagan and Obama have in common, one big speech made their, created the opening for their careers. But so there was that movement, Reagan, but when he governed with Democrats, which he had to do in California and he had to do in Washington, he was much more pragmatic. So he cut taxes, but then he agreed to a whole series of tax increases, including the deal with Tip O'Neill to save Social Security. There were a lot of things Reagan did. He backed off things when they were unpopular, little things like declaring ketchup a vegetable, if you remember, which didn't go over so well with the country. But then on big things, Reagan, when he saw that Gorbachev was a different kind of leader, scandalized a lot of conservatives who thought he was selling out to the Soviet Union. Imagine that. And so I think Reagan is, in fact, in a way, a poor guide for conservatives because you can take them wherever you want. And so in the book, I talk about Chris McDaniel, the former kind of neo-Confederate right-winger in Mississippi, who told story about one Reagan, and then Haley Barbour, the governor of Mississippi, whose motto is purity is the enemy of victory. Well, he loved the pragmatic Reagan, and these were two very different guys. I guess his enduring popularity is you can say you're for this Reagan or that Reagan, but it's still Reagan, so it keeps the brand intact.
So I've got three issues I want to briefly cover and then go to the floor. First, how did conservatives, where did they go wrong in going from a Reagan who could be pragmatic and allowed himself to be pragmatic and also, won with big victories, to this purity and this ideological rigidity that you see today?
Well, I think the process of the withdrawal from the party of more moderate Republicans made a big difference. Even in the Gingrich Congress, Gingrich understood that Republicans like Chris Shays in Connecticut and Jim Leach in Iowa and Jack Quinn from Buffalo, these moderate Republicans, or in some cases, in Jim Leach's case, a really liberal Republican, were essential to preserving the majority. And so there was at least a pragmatic recognition that the party had to be more than just a right-wing party. So I think that's part of it. In the Republican electorate, there were still moderate voters that the party had to respond to, and they were a piece of the coalition you might have to put together to win the nomination. Most of those voters aren't there anymore. And so that pushes the party further right. And with the nature of the party also means that so many members are far more afraid of losing in primaries to people to their right than they are losing elections to Democrats who might run to their left. Because the moderates, the steady purge of the moderates meant that there were very few vulnerable Republicans of that sort left. So I think all of that pushed them consistently to the right. And I think there was very much a concerted strategy when Obama took office that if Obama's core promise, remember, was to end these divisions of red and blue. If Republicans cooperated at all with Obama, they would be complicit in helping the Democratic president keep his core campaign promise. And so as I recount in the book, and others have written, who have written, journalists and have written very well about this, the night Obama was inaugurated, the night of his inauguration, there was a dinner at the caucus room where a lot of leading Republicans were assembled by Frank Luntz, including Kevin McCarthy, including Paul Ryan and Eric Cantor, and they basically decided we're going to have to oppose everything this guy puts forward. And 8 days later, Cantor delivers a unanimous Republican vote against the stimulus program. About a month later, Mitch McConnell meets with his Republican senators, and Senator Bob Bennett later recounted this, basically laid out the same strategy, that we're going to sort of hand them some small defeats and slowly move forward from there. So, and if you're purely thinking of it in terms of Republican strategy, the Republican strategy worked pretty well, except for winning presidential campaigns. They took the House back in 2010. They took the Senate back in 2014. But I think this is the big problem for the party going forward. They are becoming a party of older white Americans, and almost entirely. Now, I have nothing against old white guys with white hair, but we're not the future of the country. The young people, first and foremost, are the future of the country, and they're very weak among the young. And our country is becoming more Latino, Asian, African American, that this is a much more diverse country. And if you want to have a future, you're going to have to broaden your appeal. So, you know, I think that there is just a core problem that they have to confront, but it's kind of built into the cake, and I think they're going to need a real crisis before they revisit the problems they have.
I wanted to ask you that second point.
That's what I think.
Okay, if it's Trump or Cruz versus Hillary, I think we would agree the likelihood is she wins and crushes, maybe 10 points or more. It could get slimmer, and she could even lose, but the likelihood.
Right.
Yeah, and then what happens to the conservative movement? Is that the crisis that you're talking about?
Well, in some ways, if she defeated Cruz by a substantial margin,
that would be
be pretty decisive. I think because it becomes very difficult for conservatives to say anymore, well, we ran some squishy moderate, and you know, which they said of John McCain, and they said of even Mitt Romney, you know, who ran well to the right to win the nomination. They couldn't say that if Ted Cruz lost. Now, I suppose they could come up with other excuses. He wasn't very attractive, whatever they would want to say, they could say. But I think it becomes much tougher.
Right.
With Trump, it is so hard for anybody to know what Donald Trump actually thinks on anything, that the sort of true believing conservatives are actually arguing Trump is no conservative. And it's interesting because to understand Trump's appeal, part of it is to a certain number of moderate Republicans who are kind of the ones who are left, who think he's not an ideologue, and we kind of don't really believe what he's saying on social issues and stuff like that. But I think if they suffer a crushing defeat, I think it opens space for people in the party to examine, who have wanted to examine where the party is going, to have their say. And I think it gets rid of some of the fear in the party of going against this orthodoxy.
And some of the conservatives you've been talking to are sort of sitting on the sidelines and they're waiting to go back into that.
They'd like to. They think the party needs to be more moderate. Some of them are quite open about it. One of the interviews I had that was with Jim Brolte, who is the Republican state chair in California. And you know, Brolte makes the case that California went through 20 years ago what the National Party is going through now. California Governor Pete Wilson, who was actually quite a moderate Republican in many ways, pushed Prop 187, which was an anti-immigrant proposal. It pushed all the Latinos into the Democratic Party for a generation. And Brolte said, we're still digging out from this. You know, this state used to be the most Republican state in the union, and now it's one of the most Democratic, or at least a very competitive state. It was Ronald Reagan's state. And now it's one of the most democratic states in the union. And so Brolte says, I want to bring all the national Republicans here, say this is a disaster you can bring onto yourself if you keep going in this direction. There are some, I write about some of the reform conservatives whom, in my view, aren't adventurous enough about where they're going, but they understand the party needs a more coherent set of policy proposals than it has today. And you know, I revisit the old compassionate conservatives, and I always tell Mike Gerson is another person I had a long interview with, who was President Bush's speechwriter, and is somebody I really respect a lot. He actually is a compassionate conservative, and I once told Mike, I said, gee, I never realized how much we liberals would miss you compassionate conservatives until you disappeared entirely, you know. But so I think there are people there who want the party to come back to a more reasonable place.
Right.
But I think it will take a defeat like that.
Yeah, I understand. Okay.
Do you agree with that, by the way?
I absolutely agree. And I think parties tend to move too far in one direction. And Bill Clinton got elected in 1992 in part because the Democrats had put up Mondale, and then they put up Dukakis, both seen as strong liberals. They got whacked. And, you know, and Clinton himself thought in 92 Cuomo was going to get the nomination. He was just going to have a trot around the racetrack, and Cuomo would get the nomination. There'd be 3 in a row defeated, and he would then win in 96. That was his game plan.
Well, you know, and then it turned out better. I don't think Trump expected to be doing this well either.
Absolutely. So,
just incidentally on that point, I do think there's a rule of 3 here, because the Democrats lost 3 consecutive elections in the 80s and said, maybe we should do things differently. In Britain, the Tories lost 3 elections in a row, and then David Cameron came along with a policy of modernization and moderation. And while my sympathies run the other way in British politics, David Cameron is a very moderate figure and has moved the Conservative Party to a different place. And so I think they need a kind of Cameron moment on the Republican side.
That's interesting. But I want to ask you now, just before let's go to the floor. You talked about the polarization being asymmetrical, and that is the Republicans moved much farther to the right, much more quickly, and became a much more conservative party, whereas the Democratic Party had not moved for a long time very far left. Now we have the Bernie Sanders moment. We have Mrs. Clinton pulled left by the Sanders campaign. And a movement, an insurgent movement within the Democratic Party that could actually, transform the party in the direction and make it a much more ideological party to the left. Do you have any concern about that? How do you think that ought to play out? Or how do you think it will play out?
See, what I'm tempted to say is that after the Great Recession and the crash of the economy, reality moved left. And by that, I mean that a feeling in the country that goes well beyond liberals or the left about the way the financial system works and about abuses in the financial system has created an opening for a critique of the market that even Bill Clinton himself now, I think, accepts. For example, he has some real second thoughts about some of the deregulation that was done in the 1990s that he signed. And so I think that Bernie Sanders, in a way, is a delayed reaction to the crash and to this long period of rising inequality. And, the interesting thing about Trump, I hope that the one good thing that can come out of the Trump candidacy is identifying the fact that there are millions of Americans who have been absolutely crushed by the combination of globalization, technological change, and deindustrialization. That's a lot of the Trump voters. And I think that even conservatives have to come to terms with the fact that, as a country, we're not going to have a healthy country or a healthy economy if we don't figure out what to do about the inequality that in some ways has been growing since the 1970s. By other measures, has been growing even more since the year 2000. You can argue about this. Yeah, and so I think when you talk about a movement left, I think the nature of the problems has created an environment in which a series of arguments that seemed quite left some years ago are not as left now. And I'd also say Bernie's a lot less left than some of the forces operating in Europe. Bernie is less left than Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party in Britain. He's less left than Syriza in Greece. In other words, in many ways, I think he's just pulling the party back toward a kind of liberalism.
Well, that may be, but I would argue that at the time Reagan was elected, it didn't seem that extreme because he actually captured the zeitgeist of his time too, in a sense that Carter was weak, the Democratic Party was wandering around, they didn't know what they were doing internationally, the economy wasn't moving, we had inflation up at 20%, all those different kind of things happening, and at the time it seemed more reasonable, but it was still a long way from where it had been. Don't you think Bernie Sanders and the rejection of trade and, various kind of neo-isolationist views that he has about the international side and his desire to sort of pay everybody go to college, boom, we'll just do it, we'll have a new entitlement program. Don't you think that's pretty further to the left than anything we've had from the Clintons going back?
I think our difference on this comes from the following difference, which is that's not an entirely inaccurate, what you're saying, way to describe it. I see it differently. I see the entire political conversation in our country as having been successfully shifted right over a very long period of time.
I agree with that.
And what I see is Bernie is a force trying to tug the conversation to a different center that is less conditioned by the right. The whole left of the political spectrum in America was vacated for a while. And so I think that
You think
enabled.
Bernie is trying
I
to
think that-
create a new center?
Yes, I think he's trying to
And you
move
think he
the center
represents the
left.
center?
No,
Well,
I
that's
think
true.
he is.
That's what Reagan tried to do, is move the center right.
I ran across doing research on the 1964 campaign, this wonderful quote from Irving Howe, the great socialist intellectual, and this is what I think Bernie is trying to deal with. In the middle of the Goldwater campaign, Irving Howe offered this axiom. He said, a law might be here advanced about recent American politics. The more housebroken the left, the more adventuresome the right. And I think the way you move the right back to a more reasonable place is to move the center of the political spectrum back to what I would see, we might disagree on this, but what I would see as a more reasonable place. And so I see Bernie's campaign as an effort to move politics away from a sort of right-leaning disposition to something that I think is more an actual middle position and maybe slightly center-left. But I think the long-term impact of Bernie, take his proposals.
So is
if you
Hillary-
start with single payer, you might get everybody covered. If you start with free college, you might actually get something done that would help kids with debt. And I think Hillary is a very interesting, Hillary's response to this suggests that, you don't start buying a house by offering the asking price. And I think Bernie is creating a condition in which the left end of politics has a different bargaining position than it had had for a long time.
Okay, we'll see.
We'll argue about that some
We
more
will argue.
sometime.
We will argue. But there are two microphones here. There may be more, but thank you. We'll start here with you, ma'am, and if you would, you might identify yourself, be fairly succinct, and remember that a question ends with a question mark.
Sherry Alpert, fellow Fall River native, and EJ, you and I campaigned for McCarthy in 1968, and that's where we met. Good to see you after 48 years. My question is, do you think...
I recently found a great piece, an old piece in the Boston Globe about G. McCarthy's great rally at Fenway Park. And I thought, what a wonderful thing for a baseball player, since G. McCarthy was a great baseball player. But yeah, that's where I met Bert Yaffe, actually. He gave me a ticket when I was 16 to go to the rally.
And you and I
at Fenway.
campaigned for Bert Yaffe for Congress in 1970. Anyway, my question is...
I love coming home.
Do you think in the case of John Kasich, it's a case of where the right didn't go wrong? And as an addendum to that, I just don't understand why where they're polling that Kasich is the only candidate in the Republican Party who could beat Cruz and Trump. Why aren't the Republican candidates who dropped out, as well as the Republican establishment, backing him, since he's really the only candidate that could win?
Thank you. It's great to see you. I've actually gotten some grief from some of my liberal friends because I've written some fairly sympathetic columns about Kasich simply because I like his spirit better than any. There's a certain, maybe there's something to working together, and maybe we do have to worry about poor people at least a little bit. I mean, there's, one of the things I actually, on policy, I admire Kasich for is he actually fought his own Republicans to have the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare passed in Ohio. And he said, he said this great thing. He's actually quite religious, Casey. He had a religious conversion after his parents were killed in a car crash. And he said, when you get to the gates of heaven, St. Peter isn't going to ask you if you balanced your budgets. He's going to ask you, what did you do for the least of these? Now that's precisely why he can't win the Republican nomination. Anybody who expands Obamacare is not going to be very popular. And Kasich is a complicated guy. I mean, this is a very conservative figure. As my liberal friends who've hit me back have pointed out fairly enough, that if you look at the totality of Kasich's positions, his tax plan is just as reactionary as all the other tax plans, just as regressive, and there are a lot of other positions he has, and he's a complicated person. I happen to like him and get along with him, but I also have never had to work for him. You know, and so I think there are some, you know, he's had complicated relationships with a lot of Republicans. I think that's part of it. But yeah, I think he is in many ways the most attractive Republican, but that's not where the center of gravity, with the Kasich who is running right now is not anywhere near the center of gravity in the Republican Party. And so he's enough different that he's been able to build a constituency that's allowed him to run second, for example, in New Hampshire. But he has lost, as Trump pointed out the other day, I guess it's 41 or 42 primaries. So, but yeah, he would be, I think, the strongest candidate they have against Hillary Clinton. And similarly, I think Marco Rubio was potentially a stronger candidate, although he did show the weaknesses you know, that he might have shown in the election. I do think Donald Trump owes Chris Christie whatever he wants, given the demolition job that Christie did on Marco Rubio. I thought he should have bribed Christie into staying in the race a little longer to get rid of Rubio earlier. But, you know, but those candidates, again, that's part of the thesis of the book. The party is not very accommodating you know, to a Kasich who was part of the Gingrich Revolution, and he's too moderate. You know, this is a problem for the Republican Party. But I do have a fondness for Kasich. I share your feeling.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name's Stuart Friedman. I'm a retired public school teacher.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
My question,
Our mom was a teacher and a librarian. One of the things I love about George W. Bush is that he married a teacher and a librarian, just like our mom.
last week I called Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell in their offices in Washington, suggesting that they allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Because
That they allow.
Medicare to negotiate drug prices.
And I bet you got a really warm response to that phone call.
With Paul Ryan, I was allowed to leave a message on a tape machine. With McConnell, I could not speak to the person, anybody in Washington, or leave a message. So I called his office in Kentucky and spoke to somebody there. And they thanked me for calling and hung up. Now, no response. That would save billions, the party of business, etc. So I would like your comment on that. And secondly, since you mentioned Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan making a great deal on Social Security, they saved Social Security. Moderators like you never mention that millions of public employees who got pensions and worked 10 years to get a Social Security pension have their Social Security pensions cut 40% as part of that deal. You never mention it. So please comment on that as well.
No, I honestly forgot that part of it. And I will now go back and look at that deal because I'm very curious about what that part is about.
Can I just make one last point? Any public employee for any job working for a government qualifying for that pension and then going and working a second or third or fourth job and getting Social Security as a pension after 10 years, as part of that deal, we were called double dippers. Remember that term?
Say again?
Double dippers.
Oh, yes, I do remember that term.
And we were penalized 40% of the pension we earned.
40% of your Social Security payment.
Pension, that's correct. I suppose to get $800 a month, take away 40%, take away Medicare, and you can see what we're left with.
Yeah, no, again, I have forgotten that part of the deal, and I'm going to have to go back and look at it. Just on the broader point of you know, the negotiating the drug benefit, I think that's going to happen eventually because it has to happen, and that you know it's always complicated. You know, Obama made his deal with the drug industry because he and Rahm Emanuel looked back on the Clinton experience and said, we can't have the entire panoply of industry against us. They're going to kill us. And so we'll make this deal on this issue. But you can't control healthcare costs in the country without having more control over drug prices. And you look at every other democracy in the world, and they have been tougher on drug prices. And you know, you know, it's complicated because the drug industry is very successful in the United States. It employs a lot of people, et cetera, but we're still going to have to do it because we can't it's not, some of the differentials between us and other countries are crazy, and we've got to figure out how to deal with that. So I think it'll come eventually as part of some new budget deal, because if you worry about the deficit, why, all the deficit hawks say all kinds of things about the deficit. Well, this ought to be part of how you deal with the deficit. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Ray Mack. I'm a neighbor of yours also, but I'm from West Bridgewater, which is close to Fall River. The question I have is a connection between the Tea Party and the right-wing conservatism with the right-wing religious conservatism. Can you make a comment on connecting those two at all?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Our mom went to Bridgewater State. Actually, some colleagues and I did a study back in 2010 where we did back-to-back polls before and after the 2010 election. And when the Tea Party first arose, a lot of people said, this is brand new. This is a kind of new libertarian right. And what we found in our study is that there was a huge overlap between those who call themselves religious conservatives and the Tea Party. In fact, we found that half of Tea Partiers also called themselves religious conservatives, and about 3/4 of Tea Partiers had many of the same attitudes on religious and moral issues as the religious conservatives. The one issue on which the Tea Partiers were significantly harder line was immigration, that the Tea Partiers were even more, if you will, to oversimplify, anti-immigration than the religious conservatives were. And this shouldn't shock us because they were the same demographic group. Tea Partiers were disproportionately over the age of 50. They were overwhelmingly white. They were kind of middle income, and they tilted a little bit Southern. So their demographics were almost exactly the same as the religious conservatives. So the way I deal with the Tea Party is as just another manifestation of the same right of center, the 20% of Americans who are on the right end of the spectrum, who've been with us forever. A reporter from the New York Times interviewed a Tea Partier once who said to her, they call us extreme, but they said that about the John Birch Society too. And I love that. The Tea Party was like the old right, except they had a whole lot of talk radio hosts. They had a television network, and for a while they had Sarah Palin's popularity. So the chapter in my book on all of this is called "The New Old Right." There is enormous overlap between these groups. If we have a footnote to this study, if you ever want to look it up, if you Google my name and Brookings and Tea Party and poll, you'll probably find these two studies we did. But there is a very close connection.
Thank you. Please.
Well, President Eisenhower proved that a moderate president can get rid of most illegal aliens. He appointed General Joe String to head up the INS early in his first term, and they set about systematically removing them, and many of them left voluntarily as a result of the program that was instituted. And by the end of his second term, it was calculated that illegal entry was down by 95%. So it's not true what people say that you can't deport them, is it? All it takes is political will and a committed executive, such as a certain candidate that we all know and love, to get this job done.
Well, first of all, thank you for remembering that history. And it is one, we might disagree on this. I think it was one of the less honorable moments of the Eisenhower term. It was called Operation Wetback, and it was, which offends us very much today and should. And you're right, it did involve the deportation of about, I think it was 1.2 million people. And so you're right that is a historical fact that is still quite different from deporting 11 million people. And I don't think that was one of our finest hours as a country anyway. Again, you could say, I mean, if you believe this is what we should do, you can point to Eisenhower, and I am an Eisenhower fan, but that is one part of his record that I disagree with. But you're historically correct. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
My name is Toby Arell. I live in Canton. I'm hoping that the two of you will share with us some positive, hopeful wisdom.
Well, that's
I'm
your job,
hoping-
David.
Positive what kind of wisdom?
Positive, hopeful wisdom.
Yes, we live in a time where most of us are absolutely horrified. We don't have to tell you why. And we're hoping that you will share with us some sense that historically we've been through bad times before. We will survive this. We will get through this. So please, before you go, think of something marvelous to send us home with.
Can I just say briefly, I am a glass 1/10 full person. And so I am very sympathetic to the spirit. I love what Sarah Palin once called the hopey changey thing myself. We have been here before, and we have gotten through this before. You can see, although at times I worry that this period resembles the bitterness of the 1850s, which we do remember ended in a civil war. So that's the downside. But when I look at this, for example, we have gone through many waves of anti-immigrant feeling in our history, from the Know-Nothings when the Irish came in to the Exclusion Acts in the 20s after the great immigration of, Irish and of Italians and Poles and Jews from the Southern and Eastern European immigration. And it's worth thinking about that a lot of the things we say now about immigrants from Asia, the Middle East, and the South, and Latin America, were things that were said about the Italians and Poles, the Jews, and others who came in the country. And eventually, we came to terms with this, and we accepted all the people who came here. And I always tell my conservative friends that in some ways I think I'm more conservative than you are, because I think the American idea is more powerful than any ethnic or racial identity that we have, and that it's turned all of us over time into Americans, even as immigrant groups have given the nature of being American a different and broader definition. So we've been through that. We've been through periods of high inequality before, where we righted ourselves, that we, the inequality we have now is similar to the inequality we had right before the Great Crash and the Great Depression. Now that's another non-hopeful side, but we got through that too. And so my favorite line on America, as many of you know this line, is the Churchill line that says, "Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities." And our capacity for self-correction is pretty extraordinary, and that's one of the reasons I love our country.
Let me just echo here just a moment. Look, I think for all the pessimism that surrounds this election, in a sense of astonishment, really, and frequent disgust at what we're seeing, we live in a community that proves what America can be, and it can be better. I mean, we're living in a community that is at the heart of a revolution in life sciences. What's going to be coming out of these universities and our laboratories, and indeed the kind of jobs and companies that are going to be created here in the next 10 years, is going to be dazzling. And we're really fortunate to be in a place. We have an educational system, a public school educational system, that is #1 in the country. Now, it's not as good as Finland, for example, but if you look at the overall quality of education, it is possible that this state is proving that it's possible to educate all children. Because they're poor and they may come from a single-family home or whatever, does not make them uneducable. That's just not, it's a myth. And I think we're helping to overcome that. We have a state where a Republican governor has got like over 70% approval rating. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, in a democratic state.
In a democratic state. And we have people coming. I keep coming back to this, you all may know this. I happen to be a mentor and a very, very strong friend of a new congressman named Seth Moulton. And if you don't think that he's helping to change our politics, I don't know if you've had a chance to get to know him yet, but Seth has got promise written all over him. He's still growing. He's doing really, really interesting things for veterans. But I've been very impressed that he represents a whole new group of people running for office who are reaching out to the other side. One of the first things he did was try to get a Republican to room with, a member of Congress. He takes Republicans out to dinner in D.C. so they can talk to each other. And he's a strong Democrat. So I think there's a lot of reason to hope in the midst of this campaign. I think what's going on at the national level, especially what's going on in the Republican Party right now, is a sad chapter. But I do believe, we'll have to wait and see. My sense is if Hillary Clinton wins this, that politics will begin to look a little more normal again. We'll be back to a place where we can. What I don't know, and the question that is so important is, are the Republicans willing, if she gets elected, to make this a governable country again? I don't know the answer to that question.
No, I think that's right. Well, one last point on that, so you pull all the hope out of us. If you look at the United States coming out of this economic catastrophe, compared to almost any other rich country in the world, we have actually done incredibly well. We're in a stronger position than most other countries in the world. Now, we have problems. We got the problem of inequality. We got a lot of people who haven't come out of it yet. Some places like this, or like where I live, are more affluent than a lot of other parts of the country. Our dear hometown of Fall River still needs some help. But as a country, we're still a strong place. This idea of declinism, I reject declinism about America. I think it's wrong. I think our relationship with the world is going to be complicated, but it's always been complicated. I think there are real possibilities here. So thank you for calling us to hope.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take these questions. The questioner's been standing here patiently, and then we're going to call it a night. There you are. Go ahead.
And you can all sign books and help my 2 daughters go to college. Yeah, just think of it as contributing to their tuition.
My name's Elizabeth Bale. I live in Medford, and I don't really understand what conservatism is really. I'm one of the things that is always said about it is it's for limited government, and I see all this, incredible call for military spending upon military spending all the time on things that the military doesn't even want, and I feel like the conservatism, or at least Republicans, just want different things. They want spending on different things, not less spending or less government. But and there's so many areas like that with that are banners of conservatism or Republicans that I don't understand, like free markets, where they're still for subsidies for oil companies and agricultural big agricultural companies, and like the other gentleman was saying, the drug companies. So I was hoping to understand a little bit more about what it actually is, and I probably never will. But my question is, I wish I could believe that Republicans are in a lot of trouble, but they seem to be doing incredibly well at the state level everywhere, and possibly in the judiciary everywhere, and they have the House and Senate. So I just would like you to comment on sort of the disjuncture between the idea that they're going down because they don't have a diverse constituency, but they're winning all over the place except possibly at the very top.
Thank you for your question. The first thought is something I'd love to talk about at length, and I can't, but I want to say that on the definition of conservatism, that first, conservatives come in many different varieties, and there are more libertarian conservatives who would probably agree with you on cutting military spending, just like they want to cut all other kind of spending. There are some conservatives who oppose farm subsidies, for example, but there are others who support, who take exactly the opposite view. And I think what's fascinating is, there's a very negative view of conservatism which can see it as primarily interested in preserving the power of existing elites. And I think that the dark side of conservatism is the conservatism that says we can't get rid of slavery, we can't pass civil rights laws, we can't empower workers or women. And that is part of the conservative, that is one way of looking at conservatives. I quote a couple of conservatives I happen to like who say conservative is a disposition that has the most to offer societies that have much worth conserving, and it offers incremental adaptation as an alternative to radical change. Conservatism of this sort, I write in the book, pulls us back, as Edmund Burke wrote, from rage and frenzy and prescribes in their place prudence, deliberation, and foresight. And so I think conservatism is about this, at its best, is about this careful balance. And by that definition, a lot of what we have is not conservatism. It's either a form of radicalism or a form of reaction. On your second point, very quickly, the very reason conservatives are in trouble in the long run, their dependence on older voters and the fact that they're very weak among the young, is why they do so well in midterm elections, because the midterm electorate is dominated by older voters and young people. There's a 40 to 45 million drop-off between a presidential election and the midterms. So for the time being, because our country has a real generational divide right now, the core of the conservatives are older, the core of the progressives are younger, that produces this imbalance, unusual imbalance, between midterms and presidential elections. But that's not good for conservatives in the long run. So I talk about that very question in the book, because it is the obvious question to ask somebody who's written a book like this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for
Please.
taking my question. I'm Paul. I live right across the water in South Boston, and you can actually literally see my house from where I'm standing. Sounds like a Palin misquote. So you talked earlier about the ideological sorting and the polarization between the two parties, which is a fact. But it seems like in the last few years there have been a lot of issues like trade, domestic surveillance, a little bit around education policy, some kinds of intervention where within both of the parties, leadership has been divided from like the iconoclast and the moderates from the wings, and you've had sort of like unexpected cross-party alliances of either the centrists of both parties or the far wings. So do you think does anything connect all of these issues, or are they just one-offs? And if so, could this be like the mechanism by which the sort of rigid polarization starts to break down?
Thank you. We're going to, our sponsors have asked us to close off. We're going to try to do this respectfully. So we're going to take all three questions. I can't see, are there two more people down?
Yeah, I'll evade the hard one and answer the rest.
Yeah,
I'll come
right.
back to your question. If you can just let the other guys go up, I promise I'll answer it, because it's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm Ethan Fitzgerald from Kingston. I was thinking a little bit about what you said with the Burkean conservative model of kind of preserving through reform and improvement. And in hearing you speak about how the Republicans, or at least modern Republicans, have prioritized this impossible goal of shrinking government, it really seems like they're more proposing a radical change as opposed to like real conservatism. And so I was wondering if you could comment on maybe whether Republicans, if they suffered a catastrophic loss with a radical conservative nominee, would you expect more of a resurgence of Nixonian and Eisenhower-style conservatism in modern American politics, or would it maybe even look to another party like moderate Democrats such as Hillary Clinton?
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, my name is Fred Hollister. I'm from Newton. This is a question for both of you, actually. You talked about the Cameron moment possibly coming for the Republican Party, and David, you talked about Seth Moulton. I'm wondering if you see anybody out there not on the land, if you see anybody out there now not in the landscape of the presidential candidates now, but somebody down the road who you think might provide that kind of Cameron moment for the Republicans, a la Seth Moulton, except on the other side of the party.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to leave that last one to David, because I was trying to rack my brain on that last question. I see a lot of younger conservatives who are willing to rethink, but I don't see them quite there yet. So I'm trying to answer that question for myself, actually, and I'm not sure who I see in that position yet. I see some older Republicans who would like to come back to that, somebody like Lamar Alexander or Bob Corker, for example, whom I think once upon a time could have led them in a somewhat different direction. I'm not sure yet whom I see out there, but I'm looking around. I'm curious if David does. Just very quickly on the other two questions, I love the question about where both parties divide. I happen to love those issues when they come up, because even when the debates are vicious, they're a real relief, because at least they're not partisan. You know, and that you're exactly right. There are still issues that don't fall neatly along partisan lines. Trade has been like that for a long time. War peace has been like that for a long time. There are a lot of dovish Democrats who vote with anti-interventionist Republicans. You know, again, I've watched sort of conversations with Rand Paul on MSNBC, where he ends up being closer to some anti-war liberal or left people. Surveillance is also one of those issues that cuts like that. So I just think you are correct. I don't know if that has any larger meaning in the long run, because, you know, for the most part on the big economic issues, the splits so far have been rather traditional between sort of extreme pro-market versus liberal or social democratic on the other side. Maybe in the next round there might be more of a middle where some of those people will come together. But you're right, those issues are there. And if I understood the question right, it is, could a Burkean conservatism come back with this? I hope so. Now, I want to warn everybody here that liberals have been throwing Burke at conservatives for at least 60 years. I went back and found some great writing by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in the 1950s about the rising right then, where he commended Burke to them. And I make a little fun of myself in the book. So, you know, I don't know if my throwing Burke at them will be any more effective than any other liberal throwing Burke at them. But I do think there is a mini Burke revival. I think there's a brilliant, and I don't fully agree with him at all, but there's a brilliant young conservative called Yuval Levin who wrote a very interesting book on Burke and Tom Paine. There's a very smart Tory MP who wrote a very interesting book on Burke. There's something going on with this interest in Burke that tells me that conservatives know they got to go back to their roots and figure out where their wrong turns came. And so my hope is to encourage them down that path. I want to close my part with a quote from Ike that I really like, that I think all of us should pay attention to, but at this moment it's particularly helpful to conservatives. Ike wrote, "Neither a wise man nor a brave man lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run over him." I think that's good advice.
Well, I'll just close with that question. Are there people coming up on the right? Yes, there are some, but it's perilous. There's another young man I'm supporting right now and extolling around the country by the name of Eric Greitens. He's from Missouri. You probably don't know him, but he was a philosophy major at Duke. He was, like EJ, he got a Rhodes Scholarship. He went off and got a PhD, became a humanitarian, went to some of the hellholes of the world in humanitarian missions, wound up joining the Navy SEALs. And he came back and wrote a best-selling book called The Heart and the Fist. And he's a strikingly interesting person. He's running for governor now on the Republican side in Missouri. And he's my kind of candidate. But here's the danger in the Republican Party. He's being pummeled because he's not conservative enough. And he's being forced to take positions. I keep on, oh my goodness. I hope he doesn't have to sell out to the right. But it's almost impossible to get the nomination. And that is what is discouraging right now about the party becoming so ideological and so rejectionist. I mean, here's the kind of candidate you'd say, this person got, I remember when Bill Bradley came back, he came out of Missouri. And we all looked at him after he came back from his Rhodes Scholarship and he went to play for the Knicks. We all thought, one day, he's going to do great things for this country. And I think that about Eric, just as I think that about Seth. And yet, in the Republican Party, I worry that there may be no room for the Erics, and I think that's what EJ's book is all about. EJ, thank you for doing it.